Okay, so...
Denise, do you mind if I come in here and just ask a question?
Please do.
Okay, I was just wondering with the students and those comments, because I guess they reflect some of the things that we probably would have thought that students might be wondering about. So how is this part of the work in terms of the peer review integrated in with the stated skills, capabilities, purpose of the course that they're doing? I mean, and sort of how does it relate to professional level skills that perhaps the students are perceiving that they need to develop as part of all of this?
Yeah, that's a really important point to raise, Jeff. And I think that's the critical thing there is how that course has been changed. So when I gave you the summary of how that course had changed from simply being an isolated assignment webby they did their critique and they handed that up for assessment. They did their digital story and they handed that up for assessment, and they did the website. It wasn't integrated enough with the whole assessment task. The change that I referred to, I should have made that point. The changes that I've implemented came after those findings from 2008. So I need to clarify that, because I hope by explaining how those changes have made, the whole review collaboration has become far more integral, both to the learning objectives, i.e. that these are absolutely fundamental skills that you're going to need as a professional. You're going to be asked to critique the work of others and your own work. You are going to have to participate in that kind of process. So that's a really important point that you've raised, Jeff, because that was the weakness in the model prior to embedding this whole process throughout. So as I mentioned, when we moved to the Moodle system, whereby students are now posting up and facilitating that process on their own without encouragement from me, the fact that they were sharing their assignments progressively just to get feedback that would help them, which wasn't a part of the assessment process at all. It was something that they did because they felt it was going to be valuable to themselves. So what is really critical about the change from the very first approach was the feedback, formative feedback and assessment was there to help them improve on their work prior to final summative assessment. But you're quite right, it was not embedded. The use of the Web 2, which is the second approach I mentioned, where we've introduced Moodle, where they've used the discussion forum to solicit feedback of their own choice, where they've used a YouTube approach to get feedback on their digital production, has been far more part of the ongoing learning approach that they're facilitating themselves. They're seeing a connection through the interaction and the collaboration. That participation is not assessed as such. It's something that they've chosen to do because they see how that progressively supports them through each of the modules throughout the course. I'm not sure if that's answered your question, Jeff.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you for all that. That was really interesting.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. And I certainly, making I think the point between the pre and post use of the e-learning system and the Web 2, I think is a really important one to emphasise that can support that process. All right, so I'll just move on now. Okay, they're just summarising really the points I've already made. Frank Cazell is a course coordinator of another course, and we undertook a study in 2008. Again, this was before those changes to the course that we've just described, Introduction to Digital Media. He didn't use any of this particular approach to scaffolding students, and what was interesting from his findings, he introduced a peer assessment process as part of the course. And what his findings were very much consistent with the literature, that there was a reduction in student satisfaction with the feedback they received when he moved to a purely peer assessment approach as opposed to a formative approach. So students were seeing it as an encumbrance. I think a lot of the disadvantages that we pointed out in the in that earlier slide were reflected in the sorts of feedback that we got from the students. And that really did, I think, emphasize the point Jeff made about the importance of feedback and assessment being integral to the teaching and learning approach and not seen as something additional or tacked on. But also the point that Falchikoff has made, and made back in 2003, that there is a need to scaffold students. And that's why I found the formative approach is a mechanism for scaffolding. But we were also interested to see whether there were other ways that we could use ICTs to provide even more scaffolding, particularly to help guide students through that process of peer reviewing and critiquing each other's work. So I'll move on to how we've done that with the peer review system. I've really discussed that, so I'll move. Just before I talk about the peer review system, as I said, there is also another of the things that's been quite integral to this using the Moodle system that I referred to earlier is the Wiki. One of the things I did explore in the 2009 offering of the course was using the Wiki as a means of engaging students in a negotiated assessment process, whereby I put up the criteria from previous offerings of the course, and I encourage students to comment on the criteria and to suggest changes to the criteria. And I'd be interested in any comments on anyone who might be participating today who's explored that. That's an approach David Bowd has certainly advocated. I didn't find I got a lot of participation via the Wiki, and I'm sure that's because I haven't explored the appropriate strategies perhaps to get them more involved in the approach. So a lot of them just kind of accepted the criteria and were happy to move on. The few that did participate I found to be really valuable. In the end, they decided they didn't want to change the criteria, but the whole approach of discussion via the Wiki on why the criteria was established as it was in previous offerings was very rich, because what it revealed to me was sometimes students were misinterpreting what a criterion actually meant or what we were looking for. So while I didn't get the level of participation that I'd hoped in, I was envisaging maybe I'd get half the students suggesting different criteria and we could discuss them. I really only had a handful of students engaging in it. But the richness of the interaction, both from the point of view of students gaining greater insight into what the criteria really meant, but most importantly, I think, in terms of the scholarship of teaching and learning, is it gave me insight into the need for much greater clarity about some of the criteria that were being set for students, because the dialogue was so rich around, well, I don't think you should have so much weighting on this, or I think you should do this differently. And really, I think it was the dialogue which was so informative for me about realizing students need much more scaffolding around the criteria if they're going to be able to critique their own work, but also critique the work of their peers. All right, so we also did a more formal evaluation of how the process worked with the review and self-assessment, whether in fact students gained confidence through this peer review process, whether they in fact did improve on their work. So the process we used for this review was that, as I described before, feedback was provided, no marks. The students were asked to self-assess their work, and they were able to allocate marks, and then I gave them feedback. So we went through a two-stage approach with the formative as well as this more grade-based approach to seeing whether students were realistic in their self-assessment, and also whether in fact they did improve after final submission and summative assessment. So I'll first of all, before showing you the outcomes from that review, I'll share with you a little bit about how we set up this system. I mentioned it was funded through the ALTC. It was originally funded as an online tool to help academics provide feedback to each other on their courses. And I worked very closely with Jeff because Jeff also had his project running around the same time as ours. And so that was quite useful because we ended up embedding a lot of the guidelines rising from Jeff's outcomes from his project as well. And I'll give you the URL at the end of the presentation because you're more than welcome to use this system either for peer review purposes as it was originally designed, or as I ended up trialing it with my own students as a scaffold for them. All right, very, very quickly, it's an online system. It has a template. There's lots of modules which allow you to work as an administrator to allow users to have access to the system. You can also enable people to come in as users who only have the right to review work that's already been placed on the system, or you can come in as an author and create your own individualized peer reviews. All of the data is stored in a database, and you can choose who has access to that data. So we modified that peer review system for use with the students for formative and summative purposes. So here's some screenshots of the system. You can see you've got a menu page. You go in, create a new review, or you can go in and manage existing reviews, select an existing review, or you can add new reviewers. Here's the screen where I set up the assignment. So here's the stage where I was setting up for the self and peer review for assignment 1 for the course that we've just been discussing. I set up the dates and when that review is available and how long it lasts before it closes off. I can then set up banks and criteria using the various tools that you can see at the top there. So large categories and under categories would be individual criteria which align with the assessment criteria in this case. That screenshot's fairly small, but hopefully you can see enough of it. This was a screenshot taken from criteria that I was setting up for the third assignment, which was based on designing a website. So you can see the criteria include the structure of the site, the banner, the coding, whether accessibility and usability has been embedded, etc. Again, sorry for the small screenshot, but this is what the reviewer would see as they go through undertaking the review. Now remember, this can be used in a formative or summative way, can be used by the student to evaluate their own work or the student to evaluate the work of peers. And what's different about this is that, yes, we've got the criteria up there, the criterion up there, but you see the little I button, I for information. By clicking on the I button, they get a drop-down window that you can see below the criterion, which, again, it's probably not readable for you, but basically that gives an elaborated explanation about the things that they should be looking for when they review the peers' work and the things they should be looking for, of course, when they're finalising their own assignment. So when they critique their own work or when they critique the work of others, they would have the option to review all of that additional expanded information, which, by the way, can include web links and links to documents to scaffold the student. And then they, in this case, I've chosen a rating scale ranging that aligns with the actual assessment criteria and the system we were using, but that's flexible. It can be check boxes, it can be multiple response, multiple choice, it can be qualitative, and there's a qualitative box, as you can see, that I've included for all criteria. Now, one of the important things is that students obviously then can review the feedback that their peers have given. This is anonymous, and this is the sort of feedback this student received in relation so far. There's only 2 comments so far, oh, 4, sorry. 2 rated the student as achieving a good level of performance on that criterion, 2 as fair. And then there's the qualitative comments below. And students